Okay, this session is looking at timeout. Most of the students probably have heard about timeout as a procedure where you use a naughty chair or naughty step to put the child out of the context in which the child is finding themselves at the moment, and use it as a punishment for undesired behaviour, for disruptive behaviour, and so forth. And usually it is linked with a lot of additional behaviour problems because the kids don't want to go to the room or to the seat, and altogether it is a very difficult procedure, and in some cases it has actually been not permitted to be used in some situations because it is such an aversive procedure. So here we are now looking at what actually timeout is and how to use it appropriately. Well, first of all, the biggest mistake people make is that they think timeout means just get out of the room, get out of the situation. That is not what timeout is about at all. Timeout should properly be called timeout from positive reinforcement. Okay, so here we have the most important thing on timeout is actually that it's timeout from positive reinforcement. So we know that positive reinforcement is a stimulus that is added after the behaviour that increases the likelihood of the behaviour occurring, the probability of the behaviour. So timeout means, from positive reinforcement, means that this is the important point. We need to time out from that positive reinforcer who or which actually reinforces the behaviour in question. That is the important point, and we're going to spend some time thinking about that. Because if we know what is positively reinforcing the undesired behaviour, then we don't have to remove the whole child, because we're just removing the positive reinforcer. That is what timeout means. It means removing the positive reinforcer, no longer positively reinforcing the behaviour. In that sense, it's very similar to some other procedures that we've discussed under alternatives to physical punishment. That when we want to reduce behaviour, well, we'll stop reinforcing it for starters. So timeout from positive reinforcement is really the idea of stop reinforcing the behaviour that you don't want. Now, for the most part, the important point is to identify the positive reinforcer and removing it, giving the positive reinforcer timeout, you could say. So we're removing the positive reinforcer and thereby no longer reinforcing the behaviour that's undesired. And we've already discussed the extinction burst and so forth. Thereby we will experience that this behaviour eventually will subside. Now, the issue with timeout is that from positive reinforcement is that it's very often, sometimes it's the case that we don't actually know what is positively reinforcing the undesired behaviour, or we don't have control over it. That's really the two things. We either don't know what it is, or we don't have control over it. If we don't know what it is, we should look more closely. We should observe more precisely until we find what actually is positively reinforcing the behaviour. If we can't find it, if we just cannot put our finger on it, because it's maybe it's avoidance behaviour, maybe it's negatively reinforced or whatever. We don't know what is reinforcing the behaviour. That and only then is a situation where we might remove the entire child from a situation, and is purely removing the child from any possible positive reinforcer that is in the environment that they find themselves in, where the undesired behaviour occurs. That's the only reason why we would possibly remove the whole child, because we cannot identify what is actually positively reinforcing the undesired behaviour. Does that make sense? So really the important point is that we need to reinforce a positive reinforcer, and only if we can't find it, if we don't know what it is, if we have looked and looked and we can't see it, then we'll remove the entire child, so that any potential positive reinforcer that we don't actually know in that particular environment is no longer available. The other thing would be, if we know that what is positively reinforcing the behaviour, the undesired behaviour, but we don't have actually control over it, we cannot remove it. Okay, that would be an example where in a large classroom, we know they're messing around, the undesired behaviour, they're shouting curse words or whatever, and the peers do a lot of giggling, and the giggling and the laughing of the peers is actually positively reinforcing the undesired behaviour. We may not have control over the giggling and the funny faces that the peers make, so we might remove the whole child because that is the easiest way to deal with it, because they're not going to get the giggles and the funny faces if they behave like that outside the door or somewhere else. So the two times that we would remove the entire child from the situation is when we don't know what's positively reinforcing the behaviour, or we don't have control over it. Any other time when we know what's positively reinforcing the behaviour and we have control over it, we don't remove the entire child, we just remove the positive reinforcer from the situation. So let's have a look at the procedures. But it's very important to keep in mind that that is actually what timeout from positive reinforcement is about, and nothing else. So if properly used, it is almost always effective in decreasing unwanted behaviour, because, as we said before, if an unwanted behaviour is positively reinforced, which it is, otherwise it wouldn't be occurring at a high frequency, we know by definition there's something is positively reinforcing the behaviour, because otherwise it wouldn't be there at the high frequency, it wouldn't be maintained. So the timeout from positive reinforcement removes the positive reinforcer, and thereby it is effective in decreasing that unwanted behaviour. Obviously, we talked about corporal punishment earlier. It is a very sophisticated alternative to corporal punishment, because obviously there's no bodily harm involved in this, and it preserves the dignity and integrity of the individual individual child that we're working with, or individual that we're working with. And it is effective with out-of-control behaviour that has not responded to positive reinforcement. This is an important point, because we are, by and large, always trying to use positive reinforcement first of all. Before we do any reducing of behaviour, we are trying to increase alternatives. We have talked about that earlier, the differential reinforcement of others' alternative behaviours, or so forth. But that's our first port of call. We're trying to increase and positively reinforce other behaviours, but sometimes we come across behaviours that are so out of control that actually doesn't work. We need to have another procedure, and timeout from positive reinforcement is one of those quite effective procedures. So for the most part, we have to use it when it's when the reinforcer is actually social, and we don't have control over the social contingencies that, as I said before, the giggles and the laughs and the funny faces that the peers make in a classroom are very much more difficult to control than just sending the child out of the room for a moment. But there's obviously then the side effects with sending the child out of the room, that it leaves the teacher in a negative reinforcement trap, because it negatively reinforces exactly that type of behaviour in the teacher, the sending out of room behaviour, because the young person that caused the problem, the behaviour that caused the problem, is no longer in the room. So the teacher's going to use that strategy again and again, because it seems to give them a bit of peace. Timeout, if you're removing the entire person, that means we're removing the person from the opportunity to receive attention. And that's the important point, that when we do send somebody into a timeout situation, timeout from positive reinforcement, it's really important that they don't receive reinforcement in that situation. That is, when we think about it very clearly, when we remove them from positive reinforcement potentials, then we need to obviously make sure that they don't receive any positive reinforcement for any misbehaviour in the timeout situation. But ideally, we are removing the reinforcer from the person, from the behaviour. Like, for instance, if the children misbehave in front of the television, we don't have to send the children out of the room, we just switch the television off. That's removing the positive reinforcer. That television is getting time out. So the basic steps is, first of all, we're selecting the candidates for using timeout. That's the candidates in terms of the people, but also in terms of the behaviour. We don't use it for all behaviours. There are some, and we don't use it for all individuals. I mean, as children get older, it's probably not the best procedure to use. you might use it with younger children or with adults who have disabilities in institutions, if they, but not if they are self-abusive individuals, or probably with adolescents for the most part. It's a difficult one to use as well. But timeout, if the positive reinforcer gets timeout, I mean, it's easy to use. Like if your son, 17-year-old son, doesn't do his homework because he plays on his iPod all the time, well, then the iPod gets timeout. That's not a big problem. You can just say, right, okay, the iPod gets timeout until the homework's done, and then it gets back in again. And you can set up a contingency such as there's peaceful time to play with iPod after so much homework is done, with no mother or father nagging at them, can be quite a good reinforcer for a 17-year-old. You need to obviously be very clear to define the behaviour to change, which is the same for all behaviour intervention strategies. You always want to be really clear what behaviour has to be changed, or what is the behaviour target, or the target behaviour for change. And again, you don't, as a teacher therapist, you don't go out and necessarily decide that yourself. You go to the individual that you're working with, if they're very young or have a severe learning disability, you go to their caregivers to discuss what is the desired behaviour for change. There are obviously certain behaviours that are just expected. Say, for instance, to certain behaviours that are expected in a classroom or in a social situation that are not acceptable. And we have in the classroom, obviously, we also have the national curriculum that we have to adhere to. So there are certain rules, and obviously those would be the agreed behaviours to change. And when we talk about the behaviours to change, we need to talk about the behaviours that should decrease as well as increase. So get the balance. We're talking about balancing the behaviour repertoires. Then you go and measure the behaviour. We've talked about the measurement of behaviour, but which dimension are we measuring the behaviour on? Obviously, that's an important thing. We need to measure the behaviour, frequency, duration, intensity, whatever. Then we set the goal for the target behaviour. What is actually the goal? How, what in terms of dimensions, how much of that behaviour is a target? We can say to sit quietly, but in a classroom, say for instance, to sit quietly and listen to the teacher would be the target behaviour for a certain amount of time. But how long is that for? Is there duration they have to do that? Is there a certain task they have to do that for? And after that, they can do something else. And if you are using timeout as in removing the whole child from a situation, you need to decide on a place for timeout. You need to prepare that place. It has to be safe and free from toys and easily monitored, and has to have easy access. So in a home situation, if there's a lot of misbehaviour and the parent cannot identify what's reinforcing the behaviour and does feel they need to send the child out, maybe like a corridor with very little things in it, but the door left open, might be one of the places the child can just spend a few minutes. The general rule, and I think it's a bit crude, the general rule is the timeout should never be longer than a minute per year of the age of the child. So, a 3-year-old should never be out more than 3 minutes. But I think actually 3 minutes is an awful long time. I think you want to work with a lot shorter than that. You really want to work with very, very short periods of time. Because if you say a 10-year-old, 10 minutes is an awful long time to be in timeout. Because if you're focusing in on it very properly, you're removing the positive reinforcer from the behaviour, from the contingency. That can be done very, very quickly. Okay, and the quicker it's done, the better for everybody. So but the situation has to be safe, obviously, has to be free from any other additional reinforcer. I've got toys down here, but it's really the important thing. It has to be free from any other potential positive social reinforcer. Has to be easily monitored, so you need to be able to check that the child is not having a ball in there, having a great time, and you have to have easy access to it, obviously. Ensure that the environment is rewarding. Check if social reinforcers are in the environment, and that is really the environment that you want the child to come back into. Okay, make sure that the environment in the timeout room is not The timeout situation is not socially rewarding, but when they come back again, the environment is very rewarding, so that they can actually and reinforcing. I've mentioned how long will the timeout last. I mean, I'd never think it would last longer than 2 to 5 minutes. Half a minute would do for most things. It really is just sort of saying, right, okay, just you're not getting a reinforcer. Just remove the reinforcer for a few minutes. I mean, if you think of the example of the children fighting in front of the television, you say the television comes off or gets put on pause or something. 1 minute is a long time for the TV to be on pause if they're watching a program that they really enjoy, and if they if they don't start behaving themselves better after 1 minute, then you might want to use a different procedure. If you are asking parents to use timeout, you need to explain all of those particulars on timeout with the parent and to the parent, and you might have to practice with them, because if they remove the whole child from a situation, the child won't like that very much. Okay, the child will probably, as we said about the problems with and the negative side effects of physical punishment, the child will have some vigorous responding, and probably some aggression as well. So most children don't like to be moved away from a highly reinforcing social situation. So you want to be very careful, and you don't want to use it unless you don't want to advise the parents to use it unless they are prepared to actually carry it through all the way. If they are inconsistent with timeout, they could actually make the behaviour worse. So it's a very strong procedure to be used very, very carefully. You also then explain what's happening to the child and say, if you do that again, this is what's going to happen. And you can do that not in the heat of the moment, but in a calm situation afterwards, and sort of say, okay, what just happened there is not acceptable, and the next time you do that, this will happen. Okay, so it's up to you to decide. You can do it or you cannot do it, but I'm promising you. And I think sometimes I would say I would make the child a promise, and I would say to the child, you expect me to keep my promises, and I keep my promises when it's about nice things, but I also keep my promises when it comes to these kinds of things. So if I promise you that the next time you engage in this behaviour, that iPod will be removed for a lengthy period or for a certain period of time. I will take that iPod off you. I will switch that television off. I will, you will have to spend some time in a quiet area. I'm making you that promise. And it's not a threat, it's a promise. And I keep my promises. So that usually the children understand as a loving, caring parent, as a loving, caring teacher, you keep your promises. And you say, well, this is not a threat. This is not... if you don't want me to keep my promise, if you don't want that to happen, you know what to do. But if you do that behaviour, I will keep my promise. But of course, you have to stick to your other promises as well. The promises of the ice cream after a long walk on the beach or something. You have to keep your promises channeling. Okay. To begin to use timeout, every time the undesired behaviour occurs, tell the child what will happen. Do not let the child escape from timeout, and make sure timeout is for selected behaviour, and remain calm. It's really important that if you do decide that the only way to deal with that particular situation is to actually send the child into a timeout situation. To send the child out is actually in a naughty chair or something. It's actually the least sophisticated way of dealing with timeout. It's much more sophisticated to actually find the reinforcer and give this reinforcer timeout. But if you can't find the reinforcer, or you don't have control over the reinforcer, you need to remain very calm. Okay, if you start getting into a whole temper, you probably accidentally reinforce behaviours that you really don't want to reinforce. And then you have to review to be sure, because if the behaviour does not decrease, well, then it's not working. So if you find the same child in a timeout situation over and over and over again, something else is happening there, okay? And my educated guess would be that it's actually negative reinforcement that's happening for the teacher behaviour that's happening there, rather than positive behaviour for the positive reinforcement for the student. Once you have achieved the desired behaviour, you need to put a maintenance plan into place, and you need to be able to maintain the desired behaviour, and evaluate the results to be sure that that's actually maintained. So here are some examples of examples of the use of timeout with conduct disorder. And here you have a very clear baseline, although it's actually going up. So the behaviour is actually getting worse. So you want to get, you should really wait until the baseline is much more stable, rather than waiting until here the baseline is actually going up. So if the behaviour was continuing to go up, you wouldn't know whether they have whether it's your intervention or something else that's continuing the behaviour. But when you put the timeout procedure in place, you see the behaviour decreasing, and at the same time, you see the behaviour of the same child. You see the behaviour of compliance across sessions increasing. In this particular case, I think they dealt with the conduct disorder first of all, and just monitored the compliance behaviour. Now there's potential problems with timeout if you're removing the whole child. As you can imagine, the child might refuse to go to the timeout. You have to keep calm, and you might want to add time, but I think you need to be very, very careful with adding time to the timeout. I think if, as I say, to send the whole child out is the least sophisticated way of dealing with timeout. So, but you need to set it up in a way so that you can actually do it, because if the child refuses to go and you can't actually carry it through, then you're only going to cause more problems. So it's best not to use it. It's best to use a different procedure. In some cases, you might use a physical prompt if necessary. And if they're making any mess in the timeout situation, then they'll have to clean that up once things are getting calmed down again, or to repair any damages. But you must design a backup contingency in case of persistent refusal. It's not a good idea to get into a whole willpower game and struggle with the child to get into timeout. There are other ways, and we have talked about other ways under the alternative to punishments. The timeout procedure is, I'm spending so much time thinking about it with you because it is a very misunderstood procedure and a very often abused procedure. Really, you want to use it as in few situations as possible. So don't get trapped in a physical confrontation. That you see that where children are dragged into timeout rooms. It's horrible, and it doesn't make any sense. It doesn't. There must be more sophisticated ways of dealing with it than that. If there's misbehaviour in public places, it cannot be handled. Just take the child home and work with them, and return to public place as soon as possible, and rehearse a good behaviour. Okay. If in the heat of the moment, sometimes it's just best not to do it very much. It's just a crisis intervention kind of thing. You get out of there, and then you'll deal with it afterwards. Because the more fuss you make, the more likely you're actually reinforcing the undesired behaviour with social attention. If possible or necessary, use timeout in a public place, but I would advise not to do that very often. But you could potentially, you could say, for instance, there's misbehaviour in a toy shop, right? This is one way of dealing with timeout. If the child starts misbehaving very severely in a toy shop, you could just say, right, okay, out. We're going to leave this toy shop, and you could stand in the hall or outside the toy shop until the behaviour decreases, and say, okay, as soon as you calm down, as soon as your behaviour is better, we can go back into this shop, but not now. So you don't actually deal with the misbehaviour in the toy shop. You just remove the toy shop out of the equation and stand outside the toy shop and say, right, here we go. We're not going to stay in that toy shop with that behaviour. If you want to go back in again, there's certain behaviour that I expect, and I mean, I would certainly not go shopping for toys after that type of behaviour. That you don't want to do that. Or if there's very bad misbehaviour in a restaurant or something, you could just leave the restaurant and go to a quieter area, but stay with the child. You obviously wouldn't want to leave the child in a public place on their own if you don't have control over the timeout situation. So timeout is not a trick. It's a very sophisticated procedure that is based on the laws of behaviour. And if used properly, you will obviously need to use it less and less. That's the whole point. You don't want to use it frequently. It's supposed to reduce the behaviour, and if the behaviour does not reduce, well, then it's not working, so we need to find something else. A person who spends a lot of time in timeout is not learning very much. That's another thing that you have to remember. When you send a pupil out of the classroom, even if you send them up to the headmaster, they're actually not learning what you're teaching the class while they're away. So you don't want to do that very much, because they're actually not learning what they're supposed to learn while they're in timeout. So that has to be remembered. And there's a couple of favourite quotes I have from Skinner. One of the ones, civilized man has made some progress in turning from punishment to alternative forms of control, but we are still a long way from exploiting these alternatives.